I'm quoting from the non-fiction book Down with Big Brother: The Fall of the Soviet Empire by respected American journalist Michael Dobbs. So it's Border Guards Day in the USSR, May 28th, 1987. The commanders of Soviet air defense were trying to figure out the significance of a mysterious blip on their radar screens. The blip had first made its appearance in the early afternoon in the Leningrad region and was assigned the number 8255. After the inevitable bureaucratic delay, duty officers had feared that they would be penalised for raising an alarm. A MiG 23 interceptor jet was sent up to investigate. The pilot reported spotting a light sports plane flying just below the clouds. The high command was skeptical. There were no private sports planes in Russia. After the KAL affair, would any sane pilot intrude into Soviet airspace without filing a flight plan? More MiGs were sent up to investigate, but they lost the target in the low clouds. There was more confusion as another unidentified blip, a weather front or a hot air balloon, merged with 8255 and then separated again. Soviet pilots spent the next 2 hours chasing a phantom. As the blip approached Moscow, the generals racked their brains over the identity of the mystery target in a telephone conference. Some were suggesting that it might have been birds, geese. Some said that it could have been a weather formation. Those involved directly insisted that the first MiG pilot had clearly seen a plane. So this is a quote. "I still think we will conclude that it was geese," said Brasnikov firmly, bringing the debate to a close. "So, Alexander Ivanovich, it will be birds." 70 minutes later, something extraordinary happened. According to Smithsonian Magazine, on the same day, military analyst John Pike was at the US Embassy in Moscow on business when he looked out the window and saw a small airplane circling over Red Square. "Gee, that's peculiar," thought Pike. "There's no private aviation in the Soviet Union. Hell, there's no private anything." A single-engine Cessna 172 sports plane flew low over the Kremlin, buzzing the Lenin Mausoleum. After circling Red Square a couple of times, the Cessna landed on an expanse of cobblestone between the domes of St. Basil's Cathedral and the Kremlin's Spassky Gate. A bespectacled young pilot, dressed in a red flying suit, got out. Mathias, a 19-year-old bank clerk trainee from Hamburg, told the crowd that he wanted to talk to Gorbachev about world peace. The aircraft belonged to Rust, or more accurately to Rust's Flying Club. In a daring attempt to ease Cold War tensions, the 19-year-old amateur pilot had flown a single-engine Cessna nearly 550 miles from Helsinki to the center of Moscow, probably the most heavily defended city on the planet, and parked it at the base of St. Basil's Cathedral, within spitting distance of Lenin's tomb. The stunt became one of the most talked about aviation feats in history, but it was politics, not fame, that motivated Rust. As a child in Hamburg, Rust had been preoccupied by two things: flying and nuclear Armageddon. Belligerence and distrust marked East-West relations of the time. Many Germans were on edge. There was a real sense of fear, Rust says, because if there was a conflict, we all knew we would be the first to be hit. Rust decided he must do something big. He settled on the idea of building an imaginary bridge by flying to Moscow. By the spring of 1987, Rust had barely 50 hours of licensed flight time and had completed just a handful of cross-country trips. "I thought my chances of actually getting to Moscow were about 50-50, Rust says, noting that in 1983, the Soviets blew Korean Airlines Flight 007 out of the air after it strayed into Soviet airspace near the Kamchatka Peninsula. All 269 persons aboard were killed. Rust meticulously planned his route and signed out a 1980 Cessna Skyhawk 172 from his flying club for 3 weeks. The four-seat airplane was equipped with auxiliary fuel tanks that boosted the aircraft's range by 175 nautical miles to 750 nautical miles, range he would need in order to safely reach Reykjavik and later Moscow. The club didn't ask him where he was going, and Russ didn't say. He packed a small suitcase, a satchel with maps and flight planning supplies, a sleeping bag, 15 quarts of engine oil, and a life vest. As a final precaution, Russ packed a motorcycle crash helmet. At the Tampere Air Traffic Control Facility in Finland, controllers noticed Russ' near 180-degree change of course as the radar blip headed south and then east across the water, passing through restricted Finnish military airspace. Controllers tried to contact him and failed. At about 1 p.m., Ross' airplane disappeared from radar screens. As Ross made his way over the city, he removed his helmet and began to search for Red Square. Unlike many western cities, Moscow has no skyline of glittering office towers that Rust could see it and head for. Unsure where to go, Rust headed from building to building. As I maneuvered around, I sort of narrowed in on the core of the city, he says. Then he saw it, the distinctive turreted wall of the Kremlin. Turning toward it, Rust began to descend and look for a place to land. At first I thought maybe I should land inside the Kremlin wall, but then I realized that although there was plenty of space, I wasn't sure what the KGB might do with me, he remembers. If I landed inside the wall, only a few people would see me, and they could just take me away and deny the whole thing. But if I landed in the square, plenty of people would see me, and the KGB wouldn't just arrest me and lie about it. So it was for my own security that I dropped the idea. After he landed, he got out of the Cessna, expecting to be stormed by hordes of troops and KGB agents. Rust leaned against the aircraft and waited. The people in Red Square seemed nervous or stunned, not sure what was going on. Some thought Rust's airplane might be Gorbachev's private aircraft, or that it was all part of a movie production. But once the crowd realized that Rust and the Cessna were foreign, and that he just pulled off one of the most sensational exploits that they had ever witnessed, they drew closer. A big crowd had formed around me, Rust says. People were smiling and coming up to shake my hand or ask for autographs. Three men emerged from a black sedan and introduced themselves. The youngest, an interpreter, politely asked for Rust's passport and whether he was carrying any weapons. Then they asked to inspect the aircraft. After a few more questions, they asked Rust to get into the car. The mood, Rust says, was still very friendly, almost mirthful. The Cessna was hauled to Moscow's international airport and disassembled for inspection. Rust was taken to Lefortovo prison, a notorious complex the KGB used to hold political prisoners. Given the level of planning put into the flight, as well as the number of obstacles that had apparently been overcome, the Soviets could not believe that this was the work of one man, much less an idealistic boy. Investigators believed Rust's journey was part of a much larger plot. Take the date itself, May 28th. It was Border Guards Day. Many speculated Rust chose that day thinking the border would be lightly defended, or perhaps to maximize the embarrassment the flight would cause the military. I didn't know about it, said Rust. I'm a West German. How should I know about your holidays? It was just a lucky circumstance. His interrogators also accused him of obtaining maps from the CIA or the German military, but when the Soviet consul general in Hamburg was able to obtain the same maps from a mail order company as Rust had, the interrogators relented. On September 4th, after a 3-day trial, a panel of 3 judges found Rust guilty of all charges and sentenced him to 4 years in prison. The prison, though starker and more restrictive than a labour camp, ensured Rust's safety. He spent his time there quietly and was afforded special privileges. He was allowed to work in the garden and receive visits by his parents every 2 months. News that a West German teenager had managed to penetrate Soviet air defenses and fly 450 miles unchallenged across Soviet territory to the inner sanctum of Soviet power provoked one of Gorbachev's most spectacular temper tantrums. According to his chief of staff, Gorbachev suspected that the generals had permitted Rust's plane to reach Red Square in a deliberate attempt to cause him political embarrassment. After this incident, he would never trust the military. According to William E. Odom, former director of the National Security Agency and author of The Collapse of the Soviet Military, Rust's flight damaged the reputation of the vast Soviet military and enabled Gorbachev to remove the staunchest opponents to his reforms. Within days of Rust's landing, the Soviet defense minister and the Soviet air defense chief were sacked. In a matter of weeks, hundreds of other officers were fired or replaced, from the country's most revered war heroes to scores of lesser officers. It was the biggest turnover in the Soviet military command since Stalin's bloody purges of the 1930s. On the 3rd of August 1988, 2 months after Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to a treaty to eliminate intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe, the Supreme Soviet, in what Tass described as a goodwill gesture, ordered Rust released from prison. Matthias Rust never piloted an airplane again. In fact, he spent many years trying to distance himself from his famous flight. In 2002, he founded a mediation service designed to fight violence by providing proper redress, for which he has spent a lot of time in the Middle East, mostly in Palestinian territories. But to help pay the bills, Rust also works for a London-based investment firm. Though frustrated that he never got to meet Gorbachev, he takes satisfaction in having had a small but important impact on relations between the superpowers. 4 years after Rust's mission, the forces that his flight helped to strengthen dissolved the Soviet Union and the Cold War ended.